Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final TAC talk of the current series. And a special welcome to our speaker, John Van Noord, and more about him later. There has to be the usual housekeeping, I'm afraid, so there are fire escapes here and here, and if the alarm goes off, it's genuine. No practice tonight. Toilets in the corridor, ladies and gentlemen, and the other thing to say by way of introduction is simply the format is the usual one. That is to say, John is going to speak for 45 minutes or so, but as I always say, no stopwatch, John. And then we'll have a 10-minute or so break for refreshments, and then we reconvene for a time of Q&A and discussion, and there are some slips of paper on your table. If you have a question, if you're able to write it down, it will help John to be prepared, especially if it's a tricky question you've got for him. So, as I always say, the TAC talks are designed to look at the big questions of life, questions that people have about life, the universe, and the meaning of life, and so on. And they're designed to be of general interest to people of faith, people of no faith, people who are in between, looking for something and not quite sure. So I hope that in tonight's talk, everybody will have something to take away that helps them on whatever journey they are on. So John is going to speak on the topic of how the belief in God opened up the exploration of outer space. John has a t-shirt that we gave him. By the way, I think most of you know that John is our son-in-law. We gave him a t-shirt not so long ago that said, actually, I am a rocket scientist. He worked for quite a while in NASA, and I have to read this because he worked on a form of propulsion referred to as gridded ion thruster. I think for the layman it means it's a form of electrical propulsion of rockets. You'd have to ask John what that means afterwards if you want to know more. More recently, he's been at the University of Michigan, chief engineer in the Space Physics Research Department, and he's involved in designing everything from satellites to anything else out there. There are some satellites up there. Actually, I remember seeing them being launched. Actually, it was quite moving. We saw them in the laboratory, and then we saw them going up there. And he also involved in teaching, so he's a multi-talented man. As I said, it's no secret that John is our son-in-law, and I think the first time he went into orbit was when he met Annabelle.
Maybe that was at the wedding.
Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to invite you, John, to give us a talk on how belief in God opened up.
All right, thank you, Nigel. I'm glad this didn't turn into a roast, because it always could become that. Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. If I make any Americanisms, say phrases that you don't understand, feel free to kind of wave your hand and look confused. And
I forgot to say that Annabelle has been appointed as the interpreter.
she can make sure it keeps me on track. All right, let's get ourselves going here. As Nigel mentioned, we're going to talk a bit about outer space and just kind of the exploration of outer space tonight. Hopefully I've weaved together a story that is interesting. We're going to kind of deal with a bit of the topic of faith and science. I know you had that last time. Hopefully this talk is kind of a compendium and not a repeat. It shouldn't be a repeat. There might be some overlapping from the last time, but it should be a bit unique and different what we try to do. Nigel already mentioned some of my past. So the last decade or so, I'm at the Space Physics Research Lab at University of Michigan. Right there is one of the satellites. We have 7 of 8 flying right now. Those are measuring the wind speed during hurricanes. My job on that was to design it to operate at a certain temperature range. So figuring out how hot it got and then how to design it to keep the right temperatures was the specific role I had with that satellite. We do a lot of other space flight instrumentations. They measure like the solar wind, for example. So a lot of smaller instrumentation is what my lab tends to do. The last year, the Aerospace Engineering Department at University of Michigan asked me to become a lecturer, so now I do half-time lecturing and half-time still this work with the lab, where I'm teaching a lot of students kind of the practice of engineering in something called systems engineering, sort of high design complex systems. Before that, here you see me in a little bunny suit, looking kind of interesting. This was the decade we lived in Ohio, and I worked at NASA Glenn Research Center. So my 10 years at NASA, Nigel referred to the gridded ion thruster, so that's actually what you see in these pictures. This was actually used, it was not used when I was there. We were developing and getting it handed off to a company called Aerojet. Since then, the last couple of years, I don't know, I'm kind of curious, does anybody does you remember hearing of the DART mission, where they had the satellite that flew into an asteroid? Does that ring a bell for anybody? So they actually had this thruster was on the satellite. It was not the primary propulsion, they were just kind of demonstrating it, but it was essentially the first use in space for this specific version. While I was at NASA, I worked mostly on the electric propulsion and did some, I'll say, chemical propulsion related activities too. So what am I hoping to do tonight? So I'm hoping to weave together a story to look at sort of a number of key people who really helped in kind of our understanding of the planets and outer space that kind of got to where we are today. And what I hope also to show in terms of science and faith is that a number of these, their faith was critical to them. So not only were they really instrumental in terms of where we are today, they were really driven by their faith. So hopefully this argument that there's a conflict between science and faith becomes evident that the people who were involved in it, it was not a conflict for them, that actually it was a motivating factor. And that really continues today. So that whole story of a conflict, I would argue, is sort of an artificial argument, and those who really are involved in science and often exposed to it, usually their faith is an integral part of who they will. So we'll cover a number of these. We'll be looking a lot at like the 1500s to the 1700s. A couple of key things to kind of put in your mind. So like 1450 is like the Gutenberg press. So I kind of think that that's like a key time, that kind of one of the key technologies that sort of changed how a lot was happening, and one of the contributors to like the scientific revolution. The other thing is that right after 1600, I have a little telescope, that's when the telescope was invented. So there's two key technologies to think about that really influence kind of the scientific revolution. So for the printing press, of course, not only the ability to communicate, but also just the proliferation of Bibles and being able to read the Bible and get that kind of knowledge out there were significant parts of what was going on. So, okay, we're going to start with Aristotle and Ptolemy. You're probably thinking, why are they here? Because they are not Christian, they're not deists. Aristotle is a Greek, one of the renowned thinkers. Why I have him here is I want you to understand that his view of the universe, of our solar system, pretty much is what was developed, and that idea pretty much stayed around for 1,500 to 2,000 years. So that was like the way that the universe was understood. So Aristotle thought about a lot of things. He kind of used reason to try to figure out, how do I understand the universe around me? And the way he understood or came through logic of our solar system is there were like four elements: earth, air, fire, and ether. Ether is what's in outer space, but all these are substances. Earth being the heaviest, and since Earth is the heaviest, it goes to the bottom and is stationary. So guess what? Our Earth is at the middle of the solar system because it's the hardest thing and it sinks. There also is the viewpoint that with Earth and everything, the solar system is in perfect spheres, just because that's like the perfection. And so he viewed and logically said that that's how our solar system's operating, is with these perfect spherical shapes where the planets are on them and rotating about Earth. So you have like the Earth at the center, all the planets on these spheres, that also the ether is there, so there's not a sense of vacuum. There's some sort of substance that makes them kind of rotate around the Earth. It's interesting because also through logic, he came up with the idea of the first cause, or the unmoved mover. So the idea being that, okay, we've got all these planets in motion, and we have cause and effect all around us. You keep thinking cause, effect. He's like, ultimately, there's got to be some initial cause. And so he actually is one of the people to come up with this idea of like an initial cause, that there was something outside of these causes that started it. He didn't call it God, but he just said that there were some sort of initial things that set things in motion. So that Aristotelian view stuck around. The other thing to think about is, did I do that?
No, I'll come back in a second.
Okay. The other thing to realize is that, people talk about like the Catholic Church, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, the conflict between them and like Copernicus. And the thing to realize is this was like they didn't call it science, it was like natural philosophy, but this was like the scientific understanding. So it's not a matter of like the church saying it. This is coming from outside the church. In fact, of course, he's before even Christ was born. So this viewpoint was a dominant viewpoint that sort of had nothing to do with like the church saying, well, that's what the Bible said. It was mostly coming from Aristotle and his view of how the universe worked. We move forward a few hundred years and get to Ptolemy, who basically, so Aristotle worked a lot through logic, so he wasn't trying to come up with a mathematical model to describe it, but just kind of a logical model. Ptolemy was an Egyptian who had Greek descent, pretty much took the same model. One of the difficulties with Aristotle is, you have the planets, they kind of do some weird wandering sometime from our perspective. And it's hard to explain that if you have simple spheres. And Aristotle didn't exactly try to explain that. And so Ptolemy pretty much took the same thing, but he said, well, there's still circles, but maybe the Earth isn't exactly at the center of where that circle rotates. And so it's almost like an offset circle, and came up with a mathematical way to try to describe what he saw in the heavens of sort of the weird routes that the planets took, but still was basically a Earth-centered model. And so again, this was a dominant model, stayed there for thousands of years, and pretty much is what everybody accepted as sort of the way things worked. All right, so we're going to move through a couple thousand years and just realize that the Judeo-Christian viewpoint ended up having a big way to play, a big method to play in terms of a lot of these scientists and how they kind of approached what they saw. So two concepts which really influenced this worldview. One was the image of God. So they saw that we are rational, we have a rational God, so the universe is something that we can kind of figure out. So that was the idea of the image of God coming with this idea of rationality. But they also had the idea of original sin, that we're fallen, that we're sinful. How is that relevant? Because we can't really trust our reason. And so I can't just use my reason alone to try to figure out how the world works. I need to use observation, experimentation. So a big part of original sin and fallibility really opened up the idea of experimenting and testing the world around us, like how do I understand it, and using that to basically approach. So that scientific method, that empirical approach, comes strongly out of that kind of viewpoint that we can't just trust our reason alone. There were three kinds of metaphors that were usually used, and you'll find these in some of the quotes that I give. The three metaphors, one was that nature and the world kind of operates like a clock, like it's very structured, it's very uniform, it's very methodical, we can take it apart, and it has just patterns or things that it does. Another one is it's like a book. Nature is something that we can read, we can understand, it informs us. And also that the nature, there's like laws of nature. So those are three metaphors that kind of come from a Christian viewpoint that a lot of these Christians kind of verbalize to try to describe the world around them based on how they understood nature. Because that's how they understood nature, again, they kind of came to a lot of science with this viewpoint of saying, okay, we can study it and try to understand it, and do experiments and do tests, and that's how we're going to try to learn about the world around us. So I have two verses here. Maybe this is like I'm maybe violating the apologetics kind of rule. I'm actually giving Bible verses, but I really want you to see these because this is really what was in these men's mind. These verses really describe their mindset, and it's important to understand that because that really shaped kind of how they approach things. So Psalm, like some people probably have heard it. So Psalm 19 verses 1 and 2. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. So you can kind of get this idea of how, we talk about a book, almost that kind of concept coming from that passage. Another one that was definitely in their minds was Romans 1 verses 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So again, these verses, this is absolutely in their minds, like a lot of these science, and you'll see it, because what I'll be doing is I'll be using a lot of their own quotes and stuff to describe what their views were, and you'll see these kind of themes come about. All right, so we'll start with Nicholas Copernicus. So I'm sure most people have heard a lot of these people I'm going to talk about. I've got like the 5 in here, so we're going to go through them kind of quickly. I'm not going to give you a lot of information, just enough to understand their relevance or remind you. So Copernicus, of course, is associated with the heliocentric model, the sun being at the center. And interesting, he is not necessarily the first person to come up with that kind of a thought, but what is significant is he was able to come up with the mathematical, basically come up with explaining the order of the planets. If you have an Earth at the center, it gets really confusing trying to figure out with all the patterns, like exactly how the planets out there, how are we organizing them? And they really couldn't answer that with the geocentric very well. And so the significance is he was able to come up with an order of planets by having the sun at the middle and able to predict essentially their annual rate that they go around the sun and predict it very closely. So that was his biggest impact was, yes, the heliocentric, but really coming up with being able to explain the orbits of the planets and how long it took to get around the sun in there. So that's our guy Copernicus. So he was also a church canon, so involved in a lot of the running of the church. And he also was essentially called someone like a polymath. Actually, a lot of these guys were, a term I learned was polymath, that someone who is really sort of good at a lot of different things. So not just one thing, but they're involved in numerous activities. So what are some of his quotes? Again, I'm trying to use their words to help you understand that this idea of conflict of science and religion, like obviously they put Copernicus with his heliocentric as being a problem for the church. If you look at his own words, you can see that he was very motivated by his faith. So, sorry. So the words that he says, so I've got a couple of quotes. Here's one. To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be pleasing, acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge. And a couple more quotes. For what could be more beautiful than the heavens with which contain all beautiful things? And again, the universe wrought us by a supremely good and orderly creator. So again, hopefully you get this flavor that again, Copernicus, his faith was really important to him. Not only was he part of the church, and so this idea of there being a battle between the church and and Copernicus or Galileo, yes, there was some battling going on, but understand that they're coming from a standpoint not of like a secular person, but effectively they were motivated by their faith. The other thing, again, to realize is this whole view of the heavens, like we talked about Aristotle, like that's upsetting the cart, not just like because of the church, but it's like that's the way that all the scientists kind of thought how the world worked, was basically according to what Aristotle said. So coming up with this viewpoint is, it's like somebody today coming up with a new scientific theory that kind of is groundbreaking and goes against what all the other scientists are saying. There's a lot of reluctance to kind of take on new ideas. So that's the environment that Copernicus was coming into. All right, so now we move on to Tycho Brahe. What's interesting about him, like there's a number of men here that kind of overlap and are very, very similar. So you have the Copernican model now, the heliocentric. He helped found the first custom-built observatory in modern Europe called Urenborg. He was really known for being an exhaustive kind of astronomer, so really taking a lot of detailed measurements of the stars, the planets. This astronomy was not only the first observatory really built, but was essentially the last observatory built that didn't have a telescope. So this was before the telescope was invented. But they used things like the sextant, which is in there on the lower right, to really try to get precise measurements of where all the stars and planets were. So he took a lot of detailed data. And in a second, we'll talk about Kepler, because Kepler was an assistant of his that also was sort of privy, but then used a lot of the data. But the thing about Tycho, so his model of the solar system, he kind of harkened back to Aristotle, just to show you again that people aren't moving too quickly away from Copernicus. And how he described it, if you look at the picture in the middle, is there's still the Earth, the sun is moving around the Earth, but then all the planets are moving around the sun. So he tried to come up with a mathematical way to try to describe what he saw, still said, oh, the Earth is at the center, but it's kind of this weird, way how everything else is going around the sun, but the sun goes around the Earth. Again, you got to think about the fact that this is not like, again, the church imposing, saying, the Bible says the church is at the center, so it has to be that way. This is just trying to figure out from their observations how they explain things. Again, if you and I, if we kind of forget what we know and you just went based on experience, it's like we don't feel like we're moving, right? So it doesn't seem like we'd actually be in a planet that would be moving. That seems like a very revolutionary, kind of hard thing to imagine. And so the Aristotle way is much more sort of intuitive to feel like it explains the world around us, even if things don't quite line up. So Tycho is getting kind of a little bit backwards, a little bit forward, but getting a lot of really detailed data from the stars. So what are a couple of his quotes? He was a Christian. So a lot of the quotes I've taken are stuff that often they've published, and so it's documented out there. He had statements just simply like, those who study the stars have God for a teacher. The machine of heaven is divinely governed under a given law. Again, you hear the idea of law and rules. But then he also says it was not just the church that resisted the heliocentrism of Copernicus. So again, this whole battle of ideas is kind of going on, and he hasn't fully bought into it yet, even though he's getting all this sort of data from what he's looking at. But honestly, probably the biggest reason why I like to have him here, he is important to the story, but it's also something where, since my father-in-law is a mathematician, so I have to tell a story about mathematicians. A lot of these guys were basically using maths, to do their work. And it's interesting because in 1566, the age of 20, he was at an engagement party, had a little bit too much to drink, got into a quarrel with his third cousin, and the quarrel was over who is the better mathematician. True story. So guess what? They actually had a duel over it. And during the duel, he had his nose cut off. Seriously. And so he ended up through most of his life, ended up having to have a prosthetic nose, like made out of brass. And I guess what I read is on the good days or the important nights, he actually had a gold and a silver nose that he used and put on. So if you think, mathematicians are just, beware, be careful. I know not to offend because I really don't want to duel. I'd rather not get into that. I'd probably lose. So that's Tycho. So now we get into Galileo. And again, you can kind of see this progression of kind of science and knowledge going on. So we get to Galileo now. And the big thing with Galileo is basically the telescope. So a telescope was invented, I think it was in the Netherlands, or was it, let me just double check here. Yeah, it was in the Netherlands in 1608. And within a couple of years from the patent, Galileo built his own and had like 3 times optical magnification. And I think within like 6 or 7 years, he built one with 30 times magnification. So the telescope was a big part of Galileo trying to understand things. So one of the significant things is in the upper left, you see a little crescent. That's actually a picture I took from my house when we had the alignment of planets like in the last couple of weeks. So that's a picture of Venus. That's a picture of Venus. And it's interesting because I think that's the first time I've actually caught Venus that looked like a crescent. And so what's unique about that is, if you can imagine, if the Earth is at the center and Venus is going around, you're not really going to see any phases. For the most part, if you're near the sun's here, I'm here, it's going to look kind of solid. The fact that you get a phase like this is if it's inside and you're right here where the sun's here, you're only going to see it a little crescent of it. So that's really significant for really establishing that the heliocentric view was right. So a lot of his observations are key to kind of showing that the Copernicus model was the correct model. Again, coming from this idea that we can understand the universe, we're examining it, we're looking at it. Other things that he discovered, now looking at the moon, generally from Aristotle on, they thought like the heavens were basically perfect. And so the only imperfect place was like Earth. And again, this is like an Aristotle view. And when he looked at the moon, he could see there's a lot of imperfections. It was rocky, it was not a nice, smooth, perfect body. So our heavens are not perfect like they thought they were. And that's one of the other ramifications of his telescope. Obviously, he did not make any spacecraft, but that is the Galileo spacecraft, which launched a little while ago to Jupiter. So what did Galileo have to say? The laws of nature, again, this thing about Galileo was having a battle with the church, the Catholic Church, but what about him? The laws of nature are written by the hand of God in the language of mathematics. So Nigel will probably like that one, right? Being infinitely amazed, so do I give thanks to God, who has been pleased to make me the first observer of marvelous things, unrevealed to bygone ages. So you can kind of hear that kind of passion kind of coming through. Another statement from him in a letter he wrote, I'm inclined to think that the authority of Holy Scripture is intended to convince men of those truths which are necessary for their salvation, which being far above man's understanding, cannot be made credible by any learning or any other means than revelation by the Holy Spirit. So again, you get the idea is that their faith was really important to them and how they kind of engaged the world around them. There was not a personal battle of their faith with science. It was a significant part of how they kind of viewed what they saw. So now we move on to Kepler. I'll teach frequently Kepler in some of the classes when I talk about orbits. So Kepler, like I said, was an assistant to Brahe. So he had access to all this data, all this information about the planets and stars and what their orbits were. So he was able to come up with 3 laws based on his observations. And these are things, like I said, that I use teaching to students even today. They help us to understand where satellites are in orbit. One is the fact that the orbits are ellipsed. So before, again, it was this idea that it had to be a perfect circle. So Kepler is saying, no, actually from the data, it's an ellipse. So it's that kind of oblong shape where the sun's at one of the foci, one of the points on the ellipse. The other thing he saw is that the line segment. So you can see like on the right, there's 2 dots. Imagine a planet or moon or whatever circling around on orbit, and it creates that little triangle location. Well, what he says is the alignment sweeps out equal areas during equal interviews of time. So that little segment when they have equal area, it takes the same amount of time to cover that portion. So on the right, it's moving essentially slower. On the left, it moves faster. This is, again, another part of orbital dynamics that's really important to kind of understand. And I promise I'm not going to have a lot more math, a lot more physics, but the important thing to understand with Kepler was just how important he is to kind of our exploration and just understanding the orbits. The last law he had was that the square of the time it takes to go once around, the square of that time, is proportional to the semi-major axis, which is that A. It's sort of like, imagine a circle, it's sort of like the axis, but it's a little longer. He found out that had a mathematical relationship between those. And this is, profound, because you can see how we're going from circles now to, wait, it's an ellipse. And we're looking at things that way. All right, so what are some of the things that Kepler had to say? Make sure I have the right page here. Said, I have the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is, by my endeavors, also glorified in astronomy. For the heavens declare the glory of God. Again, you hear that verse coming through. The chief aim of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed in us in the language of mathematics. Also, the wisdom of the Lord is infinite, as are also his glory and his power. Ye heavens, sing his praises. Sun, moon, and planets, glorify him in your ineffable language. Praise him, celestial harmonies, and all ye who can comprehend them. And thou, my soul, praise thy Creator. It is by him and in him that all exist. Pretty strong words, right? A couple more from Kepler. It is a right, yes, a duty, to search in cautious manner for the numbers, sizes, and weights, the norms for everything God has created. For he himself has let man take part in the knowledge of these things. For these secrets are not of the kind whose research should be forbidden. Rather, they are set before our eyes like a mirror, so that by examining them, we observe to some extent the goodness and wisdom of the Creator. And then there's, my greatest desire is that I may perceive God, who I find everywhere in the external world, in like manner also within and inside myself. And the last one, which is his personal statement of faith, I believe only and alone in the service of Jesus Christ. In him is all refuge and solace. So again, Kepler's one that I'm teaching in the classrooms about like orbits. There are what we use Keplerian orbits when we describe like the satellites. There are certain numbers we use that derive directly from his equations. All right, so the last one we're going to talk about is the hometown boy here. The one from England, Isaac Newton, that we've all heard about. Another very profound, essentially genius. There's so many different aspects of Newton that, again, he's somebody who's involved in a lot of different kind of science and math kind of thing. Effectively is one of the people that came up with calculus, and for him came up with calculus mainly to help him describe a lot of the physics he was seeing. So profound on the math line, but looked at gravity, and of course we have that, the anecdote, which there's probably some truth to it based on apple fall. So Isaac Newton, the significant thing for him was, imagine before this, they're thinking that there's this ether, or there's this solid, or there's mass, or there was something that kept the planets together. But Isaac Newton came up with the idea of gravity. There's some sort of force, like a spooky force, a force between things. It's something that we talk about always, but honestly, we still don't understand what gravity is. We know it exists, we can predict things, but we really don't know where it comes from. It is. So Isaac Newton is the leader in that kind of understanding of gravity. He did experiments with like pendulums to try to quantify like the effects of gravity, come up with equations. And I have one equation up there, which is a force equation, which is that describes the force that's present when you have two masses. So you can imagine like two planets. It basically is the gravitational force between two items, is what he came up with. And he was able to take that equation and go back to Kepler and take the equations that Kepler was coming up with and kind of tie them together to come up with an understanding of even more predictions of the forces that were along with planets. We actually also went out for a walk today on the North Sea, and they had a tide coming in. Because of his understanding of gravity, he also associated that with the tides and was able to kind of point the moon that there's this distant force that is affecting the tide. So again, we thank Isaac Newton for really coming up with that. So what did he have to say? Another person who spoke a lot about faith, and faith was really important to him. So some things he said: gravity explains the motion of the planets, but it cannot explain who sets the planets in motion. He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God, but he who really thinks has to believe in God. Sorry, let me read that again. He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God, but he who really thinks has to believe in God. This is what Newton said. Somebody who's smarter than me, I'm sure. Another one: the wonderful arrangement and harmony of the cosmos would only originate in the plan of an almighty, omniscient being. This is and remains my greatest comprehension. Again, this is the guy that produced calculus. His view of atheism, he said, atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the Earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance. And we'll wrap up with his statement of, and from true lordship it follows that the true God is living, intelligent, and powerful. From the other perfections that he is supreme, or supremely perfect. He is eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient. That is, he endures from eternity to eternity. And he is present from infinity to infinity. He rules all things. He knows all things that happen or can happen. I mean, does that sound like there are people that are struggling with their faith in science? I mean, all of them, you could see, I hope you can see, that that was a really motivating factor in terms of how they approached the world, and really drove them, that really contributed to the impact that they made on key understandings of the world around us. All right, so there's a lot now from 1700 to today that I'm not going to cover. That's going to have to be like other talks. But I am going to provide a couple of things. One thing I want to look at is a study, actually I saw this from John Lennox. He pointed this out from another book. If you look at Nobel Prize winners from 1901 to 2000, so the last century, and we look at those and they kind of quantified by the way they identified themselves. And of all the Nobel Prizes, 67% were Christian. That's how they identified themselves. Of that, only 11% said they were atheist or agnostic. There's a lot of people that didn't get the that didn't get the memo that there's a problem between their faith and science. I mean, not all Nobel are science. If we look at the Peace Prize, it's even more so. The Christians are 79%. The little bar chart on the bottom, that is just looking at the atheists by category. And if you look, on literature, getting the Nobel Prize on literature, that's the highest number of atheists with 35%. But as you look at the sciences, even like physics, it's down to like 5%, only 5% atheists. That's got to make you wonder, why are we believing the fact that there's this battle between science and faith? Right? There's a story out there, it's coming from places, it's coming probably from that 11% or the 5%. So just pause and think about that and stew on that. All right, the Big Bang. I mean, there's a ton here. We're only going to scratch the surface. That's basically the last 100 years that we've kind of really been dealing with, like, the Big Bang. You had, like, in the 1910s, 20s, Einstein came up with general relativity. What he calls his biggest blunder is the fact that up to that point, they thought the universe was static. That it was there, it was not an expanding universe. Everything was there. A lot of the people who were basically in the years before who were saying that, the faith of the people that we mentioned is not, you can't use that to justify a God, was also saying, well, the universe is probably infinite, and so that's why there's no God. That was one of the reasons they used. Well, the Big Bang, of course, Einstein wrote in his equations, added a number of his equations actually predicted a universe that would be expanding, that had a beginning, and he thought that was wrong, and so he added an extra constant in there to basically keep it like a static universe. And he later said that that was his biggest blunder. Now, he didn't do that for religious reasons, but he did that because he thought the universe was static like everybody else did. We'll quick fast forward to like the 1950s. That's when they basically discovered and were able to show what's called the cosmic background radiation. And a couple decades before that, you had Hubble, who was looking at the stars and the galaxies having a redshift. Basically, they're showing a sign that they were moving away from us. And so they're, again, looking at the data, the information, and science, and was showing that things were actually expanding. Well, how do you make sense of an expanding universe if everything is static? That's going completely against what the common thought was. It really is in like there were a couple other things which were the linchpins to finally show that from observations that yes, the universe is expanding. Now, I'm not going to talk about whether it's an old universe or a younger universe, but I want to make the point that we now have a beginning. And that's what science is saying. And we have these missions going up, these satellites going up, these images coming back. They're finding things like cosmic background radiation, where they are seeing the fact that, yes, the universe began. So you go back even to Aristotle talking about the unmoved mover. There's even more argument from science showing things that basically philosophers have been saying, or theologians have been saying. It was the scientists who were saying like, oh no, it must be like infinite. It's always had things around. It doesn't make sense to have a start. So now science is showing us that we have a beginning. So that's the thing to think about with the Big Bang is that's the common, and there's a lot of information and data out there to support the fact that we had a beginning. Okay, I'm going along. So what I'm going to move into now, so we kind of talked about all the scientists. I'm now going to try to show you some images. I'm going to show you some images that I took, then some from Hubble and some from the Webb Space Telescope, and we'll go through this somewhat quickly. How are we doing? I can get through this quickly, but okay. 10 minutes. Okay. Well, I have an audio clip here. What I want to show is, so December 24th, 1968, I'm talking about all these other people who had their faith was really motivating them. I don't know how many people, maybe a number of people know this, maybe not. You had the Apollo mission, Apollo 8, where on Christmas Eve, they broadcast back to Earth. Let's see if we can get this to work. So they're talking about the moon now, going around the moon. So hopefully you can kind of pick that up that they're reading Genesis on Christmas Eve, 1968. I'm just kind of curious, how many knew of that? Anybody? Was it a few? I figure at least a few people would know of that. So again, I hope you're getting the message that I'm giving you. Is there's a lot of people out there who, while they might be your Newtons, but kind of that journey to the moon, journey to the stars, that their faith is an important part of it. And for them to communicate that, I think the day or so before they landed on the moon, I think is pretty significant. So two images there. On the left, left is the eclipse we had this past week, 2 weeks ago. I took that from my house. So that's when it was fully. My daughter convinced me to get up at like 2 a.m. It was 2 a.m. by us. I don't know what it was here, but it was 2 a.m. middle of the night to see the lunar eclipse. And so I adjusted the contrast on there, so it was mainly red. It was all covered at that point. And you can see the moon. I took that one a couple weeks ago. Also before that, when the moon was partially not eclipsed, but during one of its phases. Here's a picture I've taken of the comet Neowise. It's hard to see here, but you get kind of two tails. One is the dust behind it. Another one is from the solar wind that kind of kicks off. Other pictures I've taken. So the solar eclipse from 2014. We only saw a partial solar eclipse on the left. You can see some sunspots on that day. On the right was in 2012, a couple of years before that. I don't know how many people remember the transit of Venus. So again, since Venus, Galileo wouldn't have been able to see this because he'd be staring at the sun. But we were able to, with filtering, I took that picture from our house, and you can see in the upper right, like I have a tree's kind of blocking it, but there's a little dot in the upper right, reasonably good size. That's actually Venus going in front of the sun. And then recently in 2024, I'm curious, has anybody seen a total solar eclipse? Yeah, I mean a total. It's like we're talking 100%. If you only see 99%, it's not the same thing. I thought it was, when we saw that one was like 85% before, I thought this is cool. This was an otherworldly experience. I mean, for me, honestly, the best thing I can put is this is the closest thing I've had to like a religious experience of a natural kind of phenomena. When the sun, I mean, think about this. The sun is like 400 times further away than the moon is, and just the ratios are right that the moon perfectly blocks out the sun. I know that's not an argument for God, but that has actually had significant ramifications of our understanding of like the sun, the ability that it blocks it out, and you can start to see, you can see in the lower left, like just features of the sun, like solar flares and stuff coming off the sun. I get goosebumps now even thinking about it. So I would recommend, if you have a chance, I think it's going to be in Portugal in a couple of years, although probably a lot of people going there. I highly recommend going to see a solar eclipse. You will not be, unless it's cloudy, you will not be. All right, so we'll close with a couple of images. Like Hubble Space Telescope. So Hubble was the astronomer who really kind of figured out about the receding, or seeing the redshift in the stars to kind of say that the universe is expanding. And so just some of these images, hopefully you've seen some kind of like that. I'll go pretty quickly, but I hope it's just to give an idea of like, these are the things kind of like we're seeing. This is a Mystic Mountain Crab Nebula. Just to get a couple of quick details, it's about 7,500 light years away. Has a three light year tall cosmic pillar. So, I mean, it just bowls your mind to kind of think of those kind of dimensions, but that's what you're looking at, 3 light year tall cosmic pillar. It's mostly made of like hydrogen with dust in it. That's mostly what's in there. So this is Hubble. We can see Jupiter. You can kind of see its moon, or not its moon, I think it's red spot. I don't think that's the moon over the red spot, I think that's part of the spot. From Hubble, we can see Saturn with actually aurora on it. I mean, I can only imagine, like Geller obviously couldn't see these kind of detail, but his, like, you remember his comment when he said it was a wonder, the fact that he's the first one to observe in telescope some of the features that he's seeing. Then there's this, like a spiral galaxy, NGC 6814. This one is about 75 million light years from Earth. And it's about 85,000 light years across. So one of the ways they kind of tell distance is somewhat with, there are certain stars that are variable stars that are very repeatable, like how they kind of vary. And the further they are away, the color shifts, and they kind of compare to stars that are closer, and they have a really good idea of how they shift while being able to tell distances. All right, we'll finish with James Webb Telescope. This launched in 2021. If you look at you can probably barely tell on the right, there's men standing at the bottom there. This is a massive telescope, so way bigger than Hubble. And it was an engineering feat. I mean, they literally had to fold it like origami to package it. So it's really a marvel that I got up there and it worked. And it's producing some amazing images. Hubble measured things more in the visible light spectrum, because James Webb is trying to look at older parts of the universe where this redshift that I call is happening. They're trying to look more in infrared kind of regions, which means they're much more sensitive to infrared light, which is just kind of from heat. And so they have like a massive sun shield on there, and they're trying to operate really cold. They're trying to operate their mirror at 50 Kelvin, minus 223 centigrade is what the mirror is at. So the first image that they released, this is a galaxy cluster. Now if you take a grain of sand at an arm's length and put up the sky, that's the amount of sky that's showing you. Like a speck of sand held at arm's length. And if you look on there, I blew up one portion. I mean, just look at the number of galaxies that are there. Not just stars, but galaxies. And just a little grain of sand portion of the sky. So if that isn't incredible, you know, I mean, for me, a space guy, that makes my jaw drop. This, what they estimate is 4.6 billion light years away. Yes, so that light that's getting to us was from 4.6 billion light years away is what they figure. And the constellation, the southern constellation, or at least some of the cluster in the middle, is like 13.1 billion years old, is what they're estimating. We'll move on to the Horsehead Nebula. So this kind of shows you some comparison between Hubble and James Webb. So you go from, on the left is, I can't remember what it's called, Echo, I can't read it, Euclid. And you can see zooming in to where Hubble's in the middle, the Horsehead Nebula. Then we zoom in even more to the James Webb telescope on the top of the Horsehead Nebula. And you can kind of just get this sense of just the amazingness of what's going on. I'm trying to see if I have some quick. All right, well, here's just simply a dying star. So exploding star and kind of the dust all around it. We've got what's called a Leo P dwarf galaxy. So that's a lot of the blue in there is the dwarf galaxy. This is 5 million light years away in the constellation Leo. The diameter of this is only 3,900 light years. So it's a small one. It's actually this one because it's mostly like hydrogen, helium, like a lot of the heavy elements. They can tell a lot of that from like spectroscopy. Basically from the light that's coming back, they know what kind of atoms basically are present. And it's mainly like hydrogen and helium. So this looks almost like what they would call like an early universe kind of like analogy. Oops, I just pressed the wrong button. I messed that up. Oh, there we go, good. The last one is the Cartwheel Galaxy. This is actually a result of, looks like a high-speed collision between a large spiral galaxy and a smaller galaxy. I mean, galaxies colliding, I mean, just again, it kind of blows your mind. All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up, went a little bit longer, just with a statement that kind of bring it forward, and I'll include myself in this now, to make my own personal statement, which is, I've got a PhD in aerospace engineering, and I would say that the more I look at the world around us, for me, the more I see God's handiwork. I mean, I have a hard time imagining how you explain it without some sort of creator being. You go from something that we start with like subatomic particles to helium and hydrogen. Those form stars. And stars sort of incubate, create heavier elements like carbon, oxygen. Okay, that's kind of cool. Now the carbon and oxygen kind of collects together in what makes like molecules. Okay, why do these single particles start making like molecules? You get molecules, you can get more complicated, you get like proteins, amino acids. Then you get like DNA. How do we start from like the stars, helium, hydrogen, this whole process to get DNA, and then to have us sitting here talking about stars? I mean, for me, it boggles my mind to imagine how you could explain that as just purely random. I would definitely line up with those early men in examining the universe. That, for me, it's an awesomeness that I can't comprehend outside of that. So I'll end it with that. I think what we're going to have a break. I'll let you, I guess, wrap it up as like what questions they can ask. And
yeah, well, that's great. This is just a pause. We'll say thank you very much. I think I've already got some questions, but thank you very much. That was absolutely inspiring.
Good.
Put your questions on paper if you can, or have them ready. There'll be a roving mic. 10 minutes or so for coffee and some refreshments, and then we'll reconvene and open it up. Thank you. John, somebody asked you a question about...
Yeah, just a clarifying question. So just, I use a number of different terms, but just to kind of think, star, galaxy, nebula. So star, of course, like our sun, is a star. Galaxy is a whole collection. I'm not sure how many stars are in our galaxy, but immense amount that are collected together. And kind of like the images, they're tend to be spinning like our galaxy, so a unique set of them. A nebula is sort of I'll say an infant like star nursery is the way I put it. So it's kind of a lot of like just gases that are in the process of either coming together with enough gravity will start forming stars, and you might have multiple stars form out of like a nebula. So those kind of three concepts. Anyway, got another one here, which Nigel knows I anticipated this one. So actually, in fact, that's my first question. The question is, what do you think are the chances of intelligent alien life? How would...
There's a bit more. There's a question of intelligent life on this planet.
And then how would that change your view of God? So what do I think? I'm going to answer it slightly differently, which is, I guess, backwards, which is, first, I think there's nothing scriptural that talks about whether there is or isn't alien life out there. So on the bottom line, it would have no difference on my view of God because it's sort of the scripture's silent. If God wanted to make another race on another planet, who am I to say? Would they need another Jesus? I don't know. It would not change what goes on for me. I worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I don't know how many are familiar. In 1996, it was actually the year before I met Annabelle. And when I was there was a big news article at the time where they thought they found microbial life on Mars. And it turns out after the fact of looking at it, okay, it wasn't that, but they might have been some natural formation. And so even then, that's not intelligent life, but it's microbial. For me, I think what are the chances?
What's a microbe?
A microbe, a very small, like single-celled kind of organism. What are the chances of intelligent life? I would say that, again, no joking aside, I think the chance of intelligent life on this planet is insignificant. And not as a joke, but seriously. Like I mentioned.
This planet.
Yeah, this planet. Like why should we be here? What's the chance that all those things I mentioned about how you get to life, we're here. And so I would say we're here because there's a creator that was involved in the process of getting here, not chance. And so the chance of it being out there, I think it's impossible to estimate. I've seen estimations of it, but depending on what assumptions you have, you either come up with, yeah, there's no chance for life out there, or, oh, there's certainly like a chance for life out there. And it's based a lot on just the assumptions people have. So it's really impossible to say. So it wouldn't change my view of God, and it's just, I think it's improbable that we're here anyway, but God's the God of improbable and makes it happen. And that's why we're here, so it's up to him. Any other questions? Mike?
What do you make of the phrase, "From dust you came, and to dust you shall return," as a scientist?
As a scientist, I mean, I think it's just simply like, I said we come from stars. Like, meaning what we're made of, the essential elements is dust, it's earth. We're made up of the same materials that earth is made up of. And so that's how our bodies will return. So it's a comment about our physical bodies, not necessarily about a spiritual aspect of us, this intelligent aspect of us. If there is a being that's outside of time that started things and we're in his image, then we're more than, it's this dust, this flesh bag right here is part of me, but it's going to return back to the essential elements that it was before. I mean, even me, the me right now is like so many of my skin cells, all the parts of my body have effectively been replaced just with new cells. So I'm not even in that sense the same person I was when I was born. I'm like a different cellular being than I was then. So dust, start off as dust, the elements of earth, and that's when like body will go back to that.
Yeah.
What do you think? Yeah. Oh, Annabelle's no. This just in. 100 billion to 400 billion stars in a typical galaxy. That's one galaxy. Remember how many galaxies I was showing you like a speck? So one galaxy, typically 100 to 400 billion. I mean, these are kind of things, at least for me, I cannot get my head around. We can give numbers, but it's for me, I'd call it incomprehensible.
What's the question? What's many stars?
It's like,
So each of those dots is a galaxy.
The question,
It's a comment really. You mentioned Newton and planetary motions and attractions.
Yeah.
He also looked at the other end of the size spectrum at what he called particles, which
Yeah.
we call molecules, of course, and how they stick together.
Yeah.
But the laws are different, of course. But I was wondering if Newton ever tried in any way to connect the two areas.
Yeah, that's my short answer is I don't know. I'd have to search more to find that out. I mean, I think, because I know, like, even the laws of the force, I think he used did he use the orbit of Mars? He used a lot of the data and stuff from, like, more the macro, and even the subatomic. I mean, I know, I'm trying to think through, another person I didn't even talk about is like Boyle, who's a chemist, like, about the same time. And again, Boyle's another one who was like this, really driven by faith, saw the world as order, and came up with, like, again, laws, the Boyle's gas law. It's not answering your question, but I'm trying to think through. I'm not aware of any specific from that connection with.
Well, could I ask you another one very briefly? In a previous talk, somebody said that a sort of prod to his faith, a support for his faith, was that there was a very abstract mathematics, even complex numbers and so on. But that was devised in a vacuum, as it were, just because it was an intellectual pursuit.
Right.
But yet when it was needed, it was completely in place when later physicists came and probed things.
Right.
What's your take on that?
On kind of mathematics, or sort of
the mathematics bit, that it was there in place.
It's interesting because we had a discussion just tonight about, is math discovered or created?
Well,
And personally, I would say I think it's discovered. I think there's something about maths that I have a hard time picturing an alien race coming to a different conclusion than us. And a lot of the maths, like these men, they used it. It was the language they used to describe what they saw. So it's sort of a universal thing that I would think that 1 + 1 is not like something we came up with to describe things, but it's like there's something outside of us that this is a 1, this is a 1. There's something about a 2. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but it's more that maths are something that show that underlying things that show, like, the order, that somehow it's a language of the order and describes the sort of the how things are related, or how, I mean, again, to use maths to get us to the moon, to describe the orbit, I mean, to do all those things. I don't think I answered your question directly, but
it doesn't, but it's a much more interesting answer than might have been. I hadn't thought along those lines.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Where did Einstein stand on the whole question of faith and God?
What did he?
Where did Einstein stand on God?
He was more, my understanding is, not exactly a deist, and so he was more skeptical. And so probably my understanding is closer to like an agnostic. And so, like, at least for my, like, there, for my talk, I mean, because I was curious about if that changes view, even the view of, like, the Big Bang and the fact that it's a beginning. And it's just not solid. There's not solid language coming from him to kind of indicate that he had much of a faith that came out of it. And so hopefully, like, at least for my talk, I'm not trying to describe that, okay, everybody believes this. Hopefully you at least realize that, okay, there's a lot of smart people, maybe not all the smart people, but there's a lot of smart people where it's not an issue. And so where it may be an issue for some, that doesn't mean it's an issue for all. So Einstein, I think it was, from what I looked at it, is sort of, he's probably more like agnostic, maybe kind of acknowledge that there's a power out there, but that's kind of the extent that he seemed to go, from what I understand. I have a lot of limits to my knowledge, so you can test the limit of my knowledge and see where it ends up.
Oh, can I just mention this?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, there's a quotation which I've come across before now, and it's from C.S. Lewis, and I wonder what your comment would be on it, whether you sort of agree with it. He says, he's looking at the history of science really, and C.S. Lewis says, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator or a lawgiver. He actually goes on to say something I haven't seen before. In most modern scientists, this belief has died. Modern scientists. It will be interesting to see how long their confidence in uniformity survives it. In other words, he's saying that modern science is almost beginning to throw away the foundations on which science was built.
Yeah, and I would say like so Lewis probably wrote that in like 30s,
He
40s,
was in his book on miracles, which was, I don't know, back in the 50s.
50s.
Probably.
And one book I meant to plug, which is not my book because I haven't written a book, maybe I need to write one, but it's called Return to the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. My talk, I organized my talk, and then I started reading this book and I realized, oh wow, the first couple of chapters are pretty much saying what I'm saying. His Return to the God Hypothesis, why that title is because he says the first God hypothesis is sort of like describing the men and the timing that I mentioned. There are like future talks that easily could happen because the Enlightenment, you have a lot of key people who started doubting it, became very vocal, but that didn't mean that, like I said, one of them I think was Immanuel Kant, who was basically arguing there's no God because the universe always existed. And so Return to the God Hypothesis, Stephen Meyer actually goes into a lot of scientific things that of the last 50 years, including the things we've learned with the Big Bang, to kind of show that actually the more we learn, the more we have these images, the more we see around us, the more we dig deeper on a smaller level, that actually there's a return, that there are people that more and more the science is pointing to just the immense organization and structure that seems to support this kind of idea that the men saw. So he's arguing that the return to God hypothesis is actually there are, and I know that my son just saw a talk last week at the University of Michigan, and it was by an astrophysicist, but it was an astrophysicist who was not a Christian until he worked on his PhD and started digging into a lot of the astrophysical things, and became a Christian in the process of what he saw. And there are numerous other stories I know of people who have the same thing. When they really start digging, it's not everybody, but it starts making them question what they're seeing and realizing that there's a lot more structure. So the thing I not disagree with Lewis, but it could be that we've shifted, I think, in that as we learn more and we dig deeper, that we're shifting somewhat back to that being a little more seen.
So believing in God, you mean?
In believing in God. I'm seeing so much design and so much, like, one example, like for me personally, there's lots of logic or things I put in my head, but how many people have heard of the search for extraterrestrial life, or SETI?
Yeah.
Have you heard of that? And so they got these telescopes that are looking for radio waves coming from other stars. They're trying to figure out if they can pick up any signal to see if there's intelligent life. So the question I have for you is, what would it take to convince you that there was intelligent life? What kind of signal, what kind of information would have you say, okay, yeah, there's life out there? I'm just curious if there's thoughts of what would convince you if I came tomorrow and said, guess what, these telescopes, they heard something or saw something. What kind of things would convince you that, yeah, there's life out there? Language. Okay, if somehow there's order in it, language.
Somebody has to be making the noise,
Yeah.
making the language, so.
Heartbeat.
A heartbeat, so kind of a pattern, kind of? Okay.
A code.
The proof of Pythagoras theorem.
Yeah. So what if we got a computer code? They actually came down and it was a computer code. Let's say it was a really simple code, or no, it was a complex code, and they ran it and actually ended up making an AI. I mean, would you pretty much all say, okay, that's got to be life out there? If we got something that looked like computer code, and somehow we could operate it, and it made like what we call AI now, you'd be like, there's got to be somebody behind that, right? That's life. Well, for me, when I think of DNA like is described as biological code. I mean, that's how they refer to it. It is, from as far as I'm concerned, a very sophisticated computer code, for lack of a better term, that's written into each one of us, that is way more complex than we can imagine. And the current thinking is that, not thinking, a lot of skeptics say, well, that's just random, the random process that's got us here. Evolution, all those things, boom, we're here, and DNA. I look at it and I'm like, well, why is it that if we got, like, from a radio signal, could be as simple as a heartbeat or a pattern, we'd say, oh, there's life out there, there's some sort of intelligence. But why is it that if we have DNA that's written in all of us, that is sophisticated code that has information in it, we don't look at that and say, that sure seems like a sign that there's something behind it and it's not random. Because even with like our DNA, think of it this way, it's a package of information that tells us how to work. Well, how do you get new information in that? Like Darwin kind of said that you start with something simple and you keep getting more complex. How do you get from something that has no legs to something that has legs? Where do you have the computer code information that says, oh, let's start adding legs on you, and now you start making legs? Like, that's brand new information that's sort of like in a DNA to do that. Well, how do you explain that kind of a step? You'd almost have to have all that in there, that, okay, there are these things that could possibly be legs and it'll now be formed legs. So for me, the idea of SETI and the extra intention, like looking for life and looking for a computer code or looking for some signal that comes down, I think DNA is a very, very similar analogy of sort of this code that's right in front of our eyes that in other situations we'd say that's gotta come from something intelligent. So I don't know what the original question was, but that was
It was an intelligent answer anyway.
okay. Any last?
Right.
John,
You can, yeah.
this is not theological. This is, you showed a picture of a dying star,
Yes.
and I don't know, does it just go pop in front of you? Does it take a million years? What happens? Is it imploding? Is it exploding?
Yeah, you're hitting 1 minute to my knowledge, because I'm not an astrophysicist. My understanding is that this is some of the process that you can get to get the heavier elements. Like the first stars might start with more like hydrogen, helium, and that you'll have them go supernova sometimes. They kind of blow, in that process of blowing up, they actually will send a lot of these like heavier elements potentially out, and then you can get like planetary systems formed. And so I think they can have cycles where it kind of blows up and it kind of comes back, and you just get the formation of like planetary stuff in that process. How long? I don't know, long time, for as far as I'm concerned.
So you're not watching and it's going.
Yeah, although it can be, I think it can be very rapid. My nephew was involved in the prediction of like, they saw a two-star system kind of circling around each other, and they saw it getting faster and faster, and it turns out it was bad data from somebody else, but initially they said, oh, it looks like this is actually going to collide like in a couple of years, and so they're watching. In the meantime, they went back and found that the people who originally took the data, there was bad data in there, so it's not going to be as close, but they would have expected it to be like a very rapid change in terms of something like that happening that we could observe, you know, getting much brighter very quickly. So that's the best I understand. So it can be rapid, like a rapid intensification of light. So, and if anybody wants to stick around and ask me questions, that's fine too.
Do you have another one, Bob? Anything else?
I was just wondering, the kind of science you discussed is something that we can make analogies from. So, you know, if you have something circling around something else and it's elliptical rather than circular and so on, you can begin to imagine it with pencil and paper, or at least with models. If the science that had come first of being the weird stuff that we get now, you know, where a particle or an electron you can say where it is, but not how fast it's going, or vice versa. Some things we heard about, I think, in the last talk, where there are no simple physical macroscopic analogies for us to compare it with. Right. So God would have been instead of creating a perfect order, as they thought, with lovely spheres which were smooth, he would be making particles or waves or things we can't really understand. And then do you think, this is a bad question in a way, but the faith relationship to the science would have been more difficult, or maybe it wouldn't have happened in the same way?
Right. I mean, that's a good question, because in one sense, you get to the subatomic and you're almost getting more chaos,
Yeah.
more probability. I think for me, I'm just still wondered that even with the uncertainty of like these subatomic particles, it still comes together and we have what we have. And so even though we can't predict it, we can't understand it, and who knows if we ever will fully? I don't know. But the fact that you can have that chaos and yet it still ends up in order, it still ends up in the formation of like, I mean, in fact, it's even more amazing that this chaoticness, I mean, it's just strange to think like in quantum theory, in a vacuum of space, they now say that particles or energy could pop into existence. That's like a physics description, not a religious description, but in physics they're saying that, oh, well, in quantum theory you can have something weird like that. And for me, in my faith, it's like, well, if that's true, imagine what God can do. If he has the ability to kind of interact with us, we're part of, I mean, we already, as Christians say, things like that can kind of happen. And so again, now they're saying, well, in science, well, maybe things like that can happen, even from a physics standpoint. So in terms of me, for faith, it adds new questions, but it doesn't change the fact that somehow that chaos still ends up in order and ends up in us being able to ask the question even about it. So, yeah. I'll stick around for a little bit.
I think let's draw to a formal close now, but yeah, stick around, John's happy to answer all your questions.
Try again. So you invite me back, I can come back?
Yeah.
Nice to hear. Okay, good.
We'll beam you down.